So I've been reading the first 43 years of the life of F. Matthias Alexander by Jeroen Staring, professor in the Netherlands, who has devoted much of his professional life to chronicling the life of F. Matthias Alexander, the titular founder of the Alexander technique. And I've been devoting my last 3 years in large part to the Alexander technique. I've almost finished a 3-year teacher training program so that I can begin teaching the Alexander technique. And Professor Rodney Mace of the Sir Robert Menzies Centre for Australian Studies at the University of London wrote in 1997 this foreword to Staring's book, The First 43 Years of the Life of F.M. Alexander. So Jeroen Staring has done a great service to the Alexander technique over the years by his writings. Almost alone, he's applied the proper disciplines of historical inquiry to Alexander's work, revealing with an almost surgical precision the province and context of the technique's founding texts. This, the second volume of The First 43 Years of the Life of F. Matthias Alexander, builds on this previous work and should be read with care by all those who practice the Alexander technique and profess its and Alexander's ideas. It will also appeal to those who have an interest in that collision of scientific, biological, and religious ideas brought about by Darwinism at the end of the 19th century. First came across Jeroen Staring's writings when I began my own research on Alexander some 7 years ago. It was like discovering a beacon in the dark wood of hagiography that seemed to make up almost all the writing on Alexander to date. As an academic historian with a particular knowledge of how the British Empire wished to reconstruct the human body, I'd always found the writings of Alexander's disciples and followers deeply irritating. Their lack of interest in the broader issues that his work raised both at the time of their original writing and now. Jeroen has consistently done much to illuminate this previously murky area. Failure by the Alexander establishment, for that is what they are, to think seriously about the provenance of Alexander's ideas and how they connect and draw on the work and ideas of his contemporaries has, almost since the beginning, done the technique a major disservice. This, coupled with an insistence that some of F.M. Alexander's ideas are immutable, has inevitably led the technique to be marginalized in mainstream healthcare and education. For example, to claim, as many writers and teachers of the technique have done and continue to do so, that Alexander was some kind of original genius whose solo discovery could change the world, exposes the paradox that lies at the heart of the technique itself. Like many before him, Alexander founded his belief system on a revelatory experience that was both unwitnessed, unrepeatable, and in the end untestable by others. By implying immutability, such a belief system closes down the possibility of fundamental change, development, and reassessment, and spreads like dry rot throughout the discourse, discouraging discussion and criticism. The belief system itself becomes patented, and those who threaten its integrity are cast in the role of apostates. Alexander claimed his ideas were about change, yet resisted to the end any challenge by others to the supremacy of his ideas, a bad habit that has been inherited by many of his followers. Historians and commentators like myself are familiar with closures of this kind. They are a defining characteristic of many New Age and alternative ways of thinking that have come and gone for generations. In turn, these closures are bolstered by an ahistorical approach to the works and life of the movement's founding figures and the disputes that surround the succession. Over the years, the technique has exhibited all these traits in considerable measure. It looks to be little hope at present that things will change. It goes without saying that Alexander was a man of his time, and what he had to say was a product of that time. What distinguishes Alexander from many of his contemporaries, however, was his unwillingness to make clear how he arrived at his ideas. In fact, I will go further than that and say that I can't think of an occasion when he positively attributes any one of his ideas to the substantial influence of another person. It is quite extraordinary, for example, that Alexander and his disciples are quick to tell you who his famous students were, as though that mattered, yet silent on the influence that some of these students may have had on Alexander himself. Were John Dewey's or Aldous Huxley's lessons with him held in silence? Did neither of these men have nothing to say about his ideas? Surely the answer must be yes, they did. But Alexander once again fails to tell us about them. In both volumes of the present work, Jeroen has convincingly demonstrated that Alexander's ideas, as expressed in his writings, are heavily derivative and in the case of his book Man's Supreme Inheritance, probably ghosted, at least in part. Failure of Alexander to admit co-authorship and the influence of others speaks of a man who throughout his life was infatuated with himself. It is no coincidence that Alexander put the self at the center of his work, but it is clear that he worshipped himself and required all those around him to pay tribute without question. Such is the familiar life of many who are charismatic. They are unable to see others except as enemies or disciples, so fearful are they of threats to the integrity of their own body. Like many men of the period, Alexander projected this fear of their own bodily and mental degeneration onto society as a whole, blaming other men, his sexual competitors, women and children, for the failures that were in fact to be found within themselves. Alexander's deep attachment to eugenics, which Jerome so carefully catalogues in this work, is clear testament to this anxiety. Many readers, especially those with an investment in the Alexander technique, may well be made uncomfortable by the main thrust of the arguments in this volume. They should bear in mind Alexander's own adage on means and ends. Read the evidence carefully, for it is here that Jerome makes his case so brilliantly. So here's one thing I want to comment on that. He says, Alexander founded his belief system on a revelatory experience that was both unwitnessed, unrepeatable, and in the end untestable by others. So here's the F.M. Alexander myth, which was told to me by all of my Alexander teachers, and I was encouraged to teach it to all of my students, and it's like a story that is universally told around the Alexander technique world. Here it is. May not have much historical validity, but in 1991, F.M. Alexander was working as a reciter, and I think like in what we would call the fall, I think like around August, September, his voice problems became particularly acute. He would lose his voice when he would recite. And so according to the myth, he would go around to different doctors seeking help, and none were able to help him. He did, however, have one clue to what was going on. That is, his friends told him they could hear him gasping for breath when he was reciting in public. Like in noisy halls filled with rowdy Australian tin miners, there were no PA systems in the 1890s. So FM heard from one doctor that he should rest his voice completely for 2 weeks before performance. So he did that, supposedly, and then when he went to perform, he found he lost his voice as normal halfway through his performance. So according to the myth, F.M. Alexander then sat down in front of a triptych of mirrors so that he could see himself when he would go to recite, to perform publicly. And he noticed that when he would do so, he would tip his head back, shorten his stature, kind of hunch his shoulders, like put pressure on his larynx, like hold with his ribs and with his feet on the floor. His legs would be tight. His whole being would like tighten and compress. And he discovered that as he let go of this unnecessary compression, that he would have much less voice trouble, and eventually he became a teacher of this technique. So his voice trouble had substantially gone away by like March of 1893. So this is the founding myth of Alexander technique. Now Rodney Mace says that Alexander founded his belief system on a revelatory experience that was unwitnessed, unrepeatable, and in the end untestable by others. But Alexander technique is easily tested by others. It's tested by the thousands of people who take Alexander lessons every month, and like it either works or it doesn't work. So I don't think there's anything mystical about the technique. You learn to let go of needless habits of compression, and by learning to let go of the way you interfere with yourself through needless tension, you'll tend to return more and more to the good use that you had as a kid before you started sitting in chairs all the time, for instance at school. So for instance in cultures where there's very little furniture, back problems are almost unknown. Like our back problems tend to come from a culture that's like continually sitting in chairs and sitting in furniture, and instead of, for instance, squatting like they've historically done in India and some other cultures.